In the far reaches of the green-shadowed hills, where the trees whispered secrets and the red clay paths carried the scent of sweat and spice, there stood a village named Ukuta. It was a place carved in rhythm. Life here beat like a heart, steady, sacred, and led by drums. From sunrise to dusk, the air trembled with their power. Drums marked birth, signaled death, led warriors to battle, and soothed grieving mothers. But in Akuta, drumming was no simple music. It was a holy act, guarded by tradition, passed down through the hands of men alone. The drum was a symbol of divine voice, and in the voice of the divine, no woman could speak. Or so they said. Generations were raised to honor this silence. Mothers hushed their daughters when their feet tapped too eagerly. Girls were taught to sway to rhythm but never to make it. They could sing, they could dance, but their hands, those warm, quick hands, must never strike a drum. And so the women of Akuta became dancers to another's beat, never their own. But Kina was born different. Even as a baby, her tiny fists beat patterns into her mother's back as she was carried. When she learned to crawl, she found rhythm in the patter of her palms on dirt. She laughed in rhythm, cried in rhythm, dreamed in rhythm. Her mother, Sanyu, a kind-hearted woman with a secret voice like wind through reeds, did not stop her. At night, when the village slept, she let Kina tap spoons on pots, slap feet on mats, and beat soft rhythms on her belly. "Your hands are speaking," Sanyu would whisper with a smile. "Let them speak before the world forces them shut." And Kina did speak, with joy and with fire. By the time she was 10, she could mimic any drumbeat she heard. She'd sit near the men's circle during ceremonies, her wide eyes tracking every pulse of the gem, every echo of the talking drum. Her fingers drummed on her thighs without her noticing. Her breath kept time. She was rhythm embodied. The elders frowned. Boys sneered. But Sanyu told her, "Do not fear the frown of men. They frown because your rhythm shakes what they thought unshakable." Then came the sickness, quick and cruel. Sanyu fell and never rose. Kina's world, once filled with rhythm, fell silent. Her mother's passing left her in the care of Barumo, a respected elder and master drummer. He had been Sanyu's second husband, a man of scowls and sharp traditions. To him, a girl with rhythm was like rain in a calabash. It ruined what should be dry and pure. He took her in not out of love but duty. She would clean, learn her place. But when he caught her one night drumming with wooden spoons on an empty gourd, he shattered the gourd with his foot and snapped the spoons. "No daughter of this house will shame me with cursed hands," he roared. Kina, clutching her broken tools, didn't cry. She only stared. Her breath quickened, not from fear, but from rage that even her own body could not silence. Barumo forbade her from touching any object that made rhythm. No clapping, no tapping, no humming in patterns. He even took to watching her feet. When she stomped them in frustration one day, he made her kneel on raw millet until her knees bled. "You will be empty of rhythm," he spat. "You will forget it ever lived in you." But Kina could not forget. She began to drum in secret once more, not with tools but with the beat of her breath. In the forest, while fetching firewood, she tapped her chest and thighs softly, mimicking the sacred sequences she'd memorized from years of listening. When she bathed in the river, she'd let the water slap rhythmically against her arms. When grinding grain, she moved the stone in perfect syncopation, her hands dancing silently with the pestle. Even her dreams returned in rhythm, echoes of drums and moonlit circles, whispers of songs her mother never had time to teach her. It wasn't enough, but it was survival. One afternoon she found an old pot discarded behind the compound. A perfect hollow. She placed it gently between her knees and tapped, the vibrations singing through her bones. For a moment she was free. Her soul leapt. She imagined her mother beside her, nodding, proud. Then a shadow fell over her. Barumo had returned early from the council. He didn't speak. He just stared at her in the pot. Then, slow and deliberate, he took it, raised it high, and slammed it against the rocks. It shattered in 5 pieces. "You shame the ancestors," he hissed. "You shame your mother." That night, he locked her inside her hut, barring the door with a wooden beam. "Sleep with silence," he said. Kina did not sleep. She pressed her hand against the wooden wall and tapped 3 times, like a heartbeat. The next day she was taken to the elders' gathering. Barumo spoke of disobedience, of corruption, of a girl whose rhythm had turned to rebellion. The men nodded. They told stories of women in the old days whose voices brought storms, who danced when they should have knelt. And how were they silenced? Barumo asked. "They were taught," an elder replied. "Or caged." Later, under the cloak of night, Barumo came into her hut with a rolled hide and a strange look in his eye. He told her to follow. She obeyed. He led her to the drum house, where sacred drums were kept under leaf and spirit. There, among the carved relics, stood a massive wooden drum, hollow and cold. He opened it. "This is where rhythm lives," he said, voice soft. "And this is where it will forget you." Before she could scream, before she could run, he pushed her inside. The lid closed. Darkness swallowed her. The last sound she made that night was not a scream. It was a beat. Soft, steady, defiant. A single palm against the inside of the drum. Then another. And another. Outside, Barumo smiled, thinking he had buried the rhythm. But inside, Kina was drumming. And the drum listened. They thought rhythm could be owned like land, passed down through bloodlines thick with pride and guarded by tradition. In a kata, the beat of the drum was law, soul, and inheritance, but only for men. It was said the ancestors spoke through skin stretched tight and wood hollowed by fire, and the hands that summoned them had to be calloused and masculine. This belief had stood unshaken for centuries, written in chants, echoed in ceremonies, and carved into the faces of every elder. But Kina, with fingers light as wind and pulse deep as thunder, defied the silence they demanded of her. She had always been rhythmic. As a child, she didn't learn to walk, she danced. Her footsteps never simply touched the earth, they kissed it with syncopated affection. When she was barely 5, her mother caught her tapping a perfect beat onto a water pot, matching the elder drummer's rhythm during a ceremony. Her mother had only smiled then, pulling her close and whispering, "Your heartbeat is louder than any drum." But her mother was gone now. Gone to sickness, to silence, to the forgotten songs of women. Barumo, the man who replaced her mother's laughter with dread, had no tolerance for Kina's gift. A master drummer with hands like mallets and a face carved from stone, he believed rhythm belonged to men and discipline belonged to him. When he first married Kina's mother, he pretended to admire the girl's spirit. But that illusion crumbled quickly after her passing. The first time he caught Kina drumming on an old clay pot with her bare hands, he smashed it, leaving her with bleeding palms and a warning, "If you want to touch sound, do it in your dreams." But rhythm cannot be beaten out of the bones. It lives in marrow and memory. And so Kina continued, quietly, defiantly. She used her breath, clicking her tongue to mimic beats. She patted her thighs, snapped her fingers, tapped the edges of windows, the spines of books, the hollows of tree trunks. Her rhythms grew more complex, more hypnotic. Her defiance grew louder even as her lips stayed silent. The other children noticed. They began copying her beats in the dirt, humming her silent songs, tapping on walls and floors when no one was looking. Some even said she could summon rain with her tempo, that plants leaned closer when she tapped nearby. Rumors became stories, stories became murmurs of awe. And admiration in a kuta was dangerous, especially when it dared challenge the sacred order. Barumo heard the whispers. He saw the children tapping their knees and smirking behind their hands when he walked by. He felt his power weakening, threatened not by another man, but by a girl who didn't even own a drum. One evening during Ukuta's grandest festival, the Festival of Sun Echoes, Kina watched from the shadows. She was forbidden to perform, of course, but her feet still moved with the rhythms. As the flames of the ceremonial fire crackled and the men drummed furiously, Kina began to mirror their beats with her own body, slapping her chest softly, clicking her tongue, tapping her fingers against her thighs. She didn't even realize others were watching until a group of children began to copy her again. Barumo saw it too. He saw his control slipping through her fingertips like river water. That night, after the drums were silent and the village lay in the hush of satisfied celebration, Barumo returned home with fury seething in his chest. Kina was still awake, tracing a rhythm into her bedsheet with her index finger. "Do you want to know what happens to girls who mock the ancestors?" Barumo hissed. Kina met his gaze, unflinching. She did not answer. "You think your rhythm is yours?" he spat. "You think you can steal what belongs to men? To me?" Still she said nothing. But her hand kept tapping. And that broke him. Barumo dragged her from her bed and through the compound. She didn't scream. She didn't resist. She only looked at the moon once as if asking it to remember her. He brought her to the sacred hut, where the ceremonial drum stood, the great talking drum carved with ancestral glyphs, only used in times of great spiritual need. He opened it. It was hollow enough for a girl to fit. He shoved her inside. "You want the drum? You live in it," he growled, sealing the lid. "Let's see how much sound you can make from in there." The drum was meant for communion with the ancestors, for spiritual calls and echoing grief. Never had it been defiled this way. But Barumo, confident in his authority and bolstered by fear, felt no shame. He closed the sacred hut and walked out into the darkness, announcing the next morning that Kinna had run away into the forest, wild with madness. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was a master drummer, and Kinna was just a girl who didn't know her place. But the rhythm didn't end. That night, as Barumo slept, a faint beat echoed in the wind. A rhythm. Not played by hands. Not echoed by men. It was soft, steady, and ancient. Like something that had waited centuries to awaken. Children began to dream of drumming. Old women said they heard music coming from the sacred hut. And Barumo? He could not sleep. The sound lived in his ears now, constant gnawing. Inside the drum, Kinna sat in the dark, breath shallow but heart thundering. She was cramped, bruised, barely able to move. But she had her fingers, and her breath, and her will. She tapped. With every tap, she remembered her mother's smile. With every pulse, she saw the faces of the children who danced with her. With every beat, she sent a message, not of pain, not of vengeance, but of presence. I'm still here. The drum began to warm. The glyphs on its surface tingled. And something old, something forgotten began to stir. By the third day, the villagers whispered that the sacred drum had begun to beat on its own. By the fifth, birds flew in strange patterns over the hut, and the sky would echo each rhythm played in the square like a mirrored whisper. By the seventh, the children began to hum melodies none had taught them, melodies that matched Kinna's silent rhythms. And Barumo? He started to sweat even in the cold. Because he knew. The rhythm they tried to break had survived. And now it was louder than ever. The dark was not just absence, it was a presence. It curled around Kinna's body like smoke, pressing into her eyes, her throat, her ears. The air inside the drum was stale, thick with centuries of silence. She could not tell how long she had been inside. Hours? A day? Time melted in the dark. At first, panic gripped her. She screamed, raw, guttural, defiant. The sound bounced once off the curved wood, then died. She screamed again, louder, but the drum gave no answer. Her voice cracked. Her throat burned. So she sang. At first, it was a lullaby her mother had hummed while cooking, a melody as thin as a memory. Then it shifted into a rhythm, long notes, short ones, humming, rising like a heartbeat. But the sound inside the drum remained flat. No echo. No chorus. Just her own breath shaking in her ears. Finally, exhausted, she let her hands fall. Her knuckles brushed the inside of the drum. Tap. The sound was small, barely a whisper. Tap tap. Something changed. Not in the sound but in the air. It shifted, slightly. Like something had noticed her. She held her breath and tapped again. And this time she felt it, not heard it. A thrum beneath her skin. A faint hum in her bones. The drum wasn't meant to echo. It was meant to listen. Kinna closed her eyes, though there was no difference. She tapped again. This time with rhythm. She beat her knuckles in a soft pattern, 3 quick strikes, a pause, then 1 long. Again. Again. Blood began to warm her fingertips. The beat steadied. Then came the visions. They unfolded not in sight, but in sensation. The air changed. Sounds that didn't come from her. Cold wind brushing her cheek. Ash in her mouth. The distant roll of drums, not real drums but remembered ones. Figures surrounded her, but not with limbs or breath. These were memories made flesh. Women cloaked in time, skin like wind, eyes burning with sorrow and pride. One had white hair twisted into a crown of bone. Another had no tongue, but her fingers danced like fireflies. A third looked like Kinna's mother, but older, tired. These were the forgotten, the erased. They had once drummed in secret too. When the men slept. When the world wasn't watching. Their voices were not heard, they were buried. But here in the hollow heart they spoke again. We remember, they whispered. Their voices were not sound. They were pulse. Pressure. Warmth. We remember you. Kinna wept. And then she tapped. Not for escape. Not out of fear. But to answer them. Tap tap tap. Pause. Tap. She told them of Akuta. Of the rules. The silence. The festival she watched from behind walls. She told them of her mother's songs, her stepfather's fury, her own small rebellions. Tap tap. Scratch. Beat. The stories flowed through her fingers. Each one a rhythm. Each one a truth. Her skin blistered. Her knuckles split. Blood mixed with the beat. But she didn't stop. Because for the first time in her life someone was listening. Not just the drum. Not just the spirits. But something older. The rhythm itself. It welcomed her. The hollow heart that had imprisoned her now became her stage. Each beat carved space in the silence. Each rhythm became a rope pulling the past into the present. She did not know if she would ever leave the drum. But she knew one thing for certain. She was not alone. And her story would not stay silent. Not anymore. On the seventh night, the full moon rose bloated and golden over the village of Akuta, casting pale shadows on the ground like the memory of bones. The people gathered for the sacred moon ceremony, an ancestral tradition where only men could drum, calling the spirits to listen, to bless, to remember. But this time a new sound joined them. A low, steady rhythm. Coming not from the circle of drummers, but from the ceremonial hut where the sacred drum, the ancestral drum, had been sealed. It beat alone. A slow, deliberate thud. Then another. Then silence. Then thud-thud again. At first they thought it a trick of wind or echo. The elders leaned in, puzzled. The younger drummers faltered in their rhythm. Mothers held their children closer. Birds stirred from trees and flew in nervous spirals. The drum continued. Its beat had no urgency, no panic. It was patient, like breath, like a waiting story. It had weight. It had memory. Barumo, standing among the elder drummers, stiffened. His eyes darted toward the hut. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "Just the wood shifting in the cold." But no one had spoken to him. He was answering the silence too quickly. Others began to whisper. That night, some slept uneasily. Others didn't sleep at all. Children awoke crying, claiming they had dreamed of a girl inside the drum, singing lullabies that made the trees lean to listen. One boy said she smiled at him and her teeth were carved from moonlight. A girl whispered that the drum had told her its heart was broken. By morning the whispers grew into questions. The sacred drum was said to be hollow but alive, carved generations ago from the trunk of a cursed Irako tree that only bloomed when no one looked. It was not merely an instrument, it was a vessel. A keeper of stories. Only the elders knew how to awaken it. But now it had awakened on its own. Barumo's jaw clenched tighter each hour. When asked about the noise, he dismissed it as a prank. When asked about the dreams, he scolded the children for being superstitious. But his eyes betrayed him, flashing wide with every faint pulse in the air, every echo of a rhythm that hadn't been struck by a hand. The village priest, Alyamo, an old man with trembling hands and careful eyes, was summoned. He approached the ceremonial hut with incense and prayer beads. He circled the drums slowly, muttering ancient blessings, sprinkling herbs passed down by his grandfather's grandfather. Then he touched it. The drum was warm, too warm. He pressed his palm flat against its surface and gasped. A pulse met his touch. Like a heartbeat. He staggered back. "This drum listens," he whispered. "It mourns." Barumo laughed bitterly. "It's just old wood and fear," he spat. "You're letting stories poison your reason." But the priest wasn't looking at him. He was staring at the drum. Sap began to ooze from its seams, thick, slow, amber-colored. It ran down like tears. The villagers recoiled. That night the beat returned. Louder. Stronger. More certain. It wasn't random. It had rhythm. It told a story. Ba, be, dum. Pause. Ba, be, dum. Like breath. Like pain. Like defiance. Barumo's sleep was broken by it. He sat upright in his hut, drenched in sweat. The sound came from across the compound, but also, somehow, from inside his chest. It was as if his heart was no longer his own, pulsing in time with something buried. He stormed outside and stood before the ceremonial hut. "Enough," he barked into the night. But the drum didn't stop. In fact, it paused. Then it beat again, this time faster, mocking. He grabbed a torch, marched into the hut, and stared at the instrument he had sealed with his own lies. He glared at it as if daring it to move. Then he picked it up and carried it into the bush. He dug a pit with trembling hands, shoving aside leaves and roots, mud caking his robe. He dropped the drum in and covered it with soil. He stomped the earth down flat until it no longer pulsed. Then he stood in silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It was humming. Low, constant, steady. His ears rang with it. His fingers twitched. Back in the village people noticed. Even without the drum in the hut they could feel it. Under their feet the ground vibrated ever so slightly, like distant thunder. Water in pots rippled when no one moved. Dogs growled at empty corners. Babies stopped crying when the hum rose. The beat continued underground. It was not louder in volume, it was louder in presence. In defiance. Barumo stopped sleeping altogether. He wandered the village, wild-eyed, muttering under his breath. He flinched whenever anyone clapped. He struck a boy for tapping his foot and screamed when a girl snapped her fingers. He stood at the edge of the village, staring into the woods as if waiting for something to emerge. The villagers began to speak openly now. What if she never left? What if she was in the drum? What if Barumo? The questions swirled like wind through tall grass. Even the elders, once firm in their traditions, now hesitated before they spoke. The rhythm had become part of them. Part of the air. Part of their bones. The drumbeat, buried in earth, was now inside them all. And it was growing. Aji was only 8 when Kina first taught him to clap to the wind. He remembered how she made rhythm out of everything. Raindrops on the roof, a goat's hooves on stone, even the way his heartbeat thumped when he ran. She never had a real drum, yet when she danced or tapped her fingers against the ground, the world listened. Now years later the memory still beat inside him. And so did something else. Each night, the ground beneath his mat throbbed gently. Not loud enough to wake his parents, but enough to stir him from sleep. It was a rhythm, not like the drums of Akuta ceremonies but familiar. Patient. Calling. One morning Aji followed it. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move when the beat pulsed. His bare feet skimmed dew-wet grass, his breath quiet as dawn. Birds moved strangely that morning, perching in unusual trees, hopping in spirals, then fluttering off only to return. A dog from the village, old and nearly blind, limped beside him with purpose. A line of ants made perfect loops in the dust. The world, it seemed, was circling something. The rhythm grew stronger as he entered the thicket beyond the ceremonial hut. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was a feeling in his feet, his chest, behind his eyes. It trembled in his bones, a message he couldn't read but somehow understood. Then he saw it. A strange mound of earth, too symmetrical for nature, pulsing ever so slightly. The grass around it was flattened, the soil cracked with tiny lines. Birds circled above. He pressed his hand to the ground. Thud. Pause. Thud thud. Pause. Thud. The rhythm he knew. Kina's rhythm. He ran back to the village. People were already talking. Dreams had returned. The wind carried melodies without words. A baby, not yet old enough to walk, had begun tapping a perfect rhythm with her tiny fists. The priest Ayamo had woken from a visionless trance whispering, "She is not gone." When Aji told them what he'd found, they didn't laugh. They followed. A crowd gathered around the mound as Aji knelt and placed his ear to the soil. "She's here," he whispered. "She's waiting." Barumo was nowhere to be seen. The villagers began to dig. Hands clawed the earth. Children helped. Women wept and scraped at roots. Even the elders joined in, their dignity forgotten in the urgency of uncovering truth. And then they struck wood. The buried drum. But it was cracked now, its surface splintered as though it had been struck from within countless times. Sap still oozed from its seams, but it no longer dripped, it steamed. Aji stepped forward and touched it. It pulsed beneath his palm, warm and alive. The priest Ayamo came forward with trembling fingers. Together, he and Aji began to open the drum. It groaned as it split, ancient wood creaking like the bones of a giant. The crowd held its breath. Inside was no body, no bones, only darkness. And a single item, a copper bracelet, etched with wind symbols, pulsing with heat. Kina's bracelet. Aji recognized it instantly. She'd worn it every day. He'd once asked her why and she'd said, "It keeps the rhythm close." He lifted it gently. It was warm, not like something left in the sun but warm like something living. He turned to the crowd. "She was here," he said. The elders murmured, uncertain. Then Ayamo raised his hand. "She is here," he corrected softly. "Not in the drum. Not beneath the soil. But in the rhythm." He looked at the crowd, then at the trees around them, the birds above, the earth below. Kina has become the rhythm. The moment he spoke the words, a breeze passed through the clearing, gentle but sure. The trees swayed. Leaves trembled. Somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat echoed from no known source. The villagers stood silent. In that stillness they realized something had changed. The world was listening in a new way. The air no longer felt like mere wind, it felt like breath. Like presence. Like Kina was walking between them, unseen but deeply known. Some knelt. Others sang softly, not in the old songs but in new rhythms, the kind Kina had created. The kind that rose from breath and earth and memory. Rhythms that did not ask permission. From that day the sacred drum remained open. Its wood, though cracked, was never repaired. The bracelet was placed atop it, never to be worn, only to remind. Children tapped again, on stones, on skin, on pots. And no one stopped them. Women clapped and drummed and danced in circles that widened with each beat. Barumo, when he returned and saw the open drum and the gathered village, said nothing. He didn't need to. The rhythm had spoken for him. Barumo had once been the loudest man in Ikuta. His voice had silenced children mid-laughter, cracked through conversations, commanded ceremonies. When he drummed, the villagers fell silent, not from awe but from fear. His rhythm was not joy or praise, it was control. But now there was no sound from his throat. The morning after the sacred drum was unearthed, Barumo tried to speak at the village meeting. He had stormed into the square, fists clenched, eyes wild. The people had turned, quiet but unmoved by his anger. The priest Alyamo had simply stepped aside and gestured, "Speak then." Barumo opened his mouth. Nothing. Not a whisper. Not a grunt. His lips moved, his throat pulsed, his jaw flexed, but no sound came. The villagers waited. Then from the trees, clap. Clap clap. Clap. A rhythm burst through the stillness, sharp and mocking. It came not from drums but from the canopy above. Branches slapped against each other, dry leaves flapping in unnatural cadence. The rhythm was unmistakable, Kinna's. Barumo staggered back, his hands flying to his ears. The villagers stood as one, not in fear but in quiet wonder. From that moment, Barumo's world changed. He returned to his house, breathless and furious. He slammed the door, bolted the windows and sat in the darkness. But silence didn't follow him. Instead, his own home became an instrument. It began with the pots. One night as he tried to sleep, the largest pot in his kitchen began to hum, a low, steady thrum as if someone tapped its side with a calloused thumb. He rushed to it, lifted it, shook it. Nothing. But when he placed it down, the sound resumed. The next night it was the windows. The shutters beat against their frames, not in the wind but in deliberate patterns. A rhythm he once forbade. A rhythm he had buried. He tried to drown it. He threw blankets over everything, stacked clothes against the walls. He smashed the pots. He pulled the shutters from the windows. But still the rhythm came. The floor creaked in patterns. The rafters echoed in taps. The very heartbeat of his house had become music, and it didn't belong to him. He shouted. Or tried to. Again nothing. In frustration he took a branch and beat it against the wall, attempting to drown the sound. But as he struck, the wind outside picked up and clapped back in time with his blows, mocking louder, clearer. Barumo couldn't live like this. He fled. With only a satchel and his walking stick, he disappeared into the forest that bordered Ikuta. The villagers didn't follow. They watched him go, their faces unreadable. Some whispered prayers. Others said nothing. The children only paused their games momentarily before drumming again on stone and earth. In the forest, Barumo hoped to find silence. But the forest remembered. At first it was only the wind. It moved strangely around him, curling through trees, hissing low tunes that made the hair on his neck stand. He tried to sleep under a broad-leafed fig, but the roots beneath him pulsed, like a drumbeat buried too long. He walked for hours. The sky darkened. The birds watched him but didn't call. At night the rhythms grew louder. They came from nowhere and everywhere, deep, pulsing beats that matched his own heartbeat, then mocked it, then led it astray. The sound would swell behind him, then vanish. Reappear to his right, fade. Sometimes he felt breath on his neck, warm and damp like a singer mid-verse. He covered his ears but the rhythm passed through skin and bone. He found a cave and crawled inside, hoping for stone silence. But as he rested, the cave ceiling echoed with soft taps. He opened his eyes and saw nothing. Yet the sound persisted, like small hands drumming above him. He scrambled out. Barumo tried to build a fire, hoping the crackle would drown the rhythm. But even the flames joined the beat, popping in perfect time, dancing in Kinna's patterns. He hadn't said her name in years. Now it was all he could hear. He wandered deeper, no longer sure of the time or direction. His legs grew thin. His beard wild. His voice still absent. One night, delirious and hungry, he stumbled upon a circle of trees with trunks wider than 3 men. They arched over him, forming a hollow like a drum. He sat, exhausted, and wept, not from sorrow but from being forgotten. Then the drumming began again. Not from the trees this time. From the air. Spirits stepped out of the shadows, not clearly seen but felt. The air shimmered where they walked. Some were tall, others small. All held invisible drums. Their hands moved and the rhythm surrounded him, low, slow, relentless. It matched his pulse, then controlled it, then let it offbeat until he gasped for breath. He covered his face. But the spirits kept drumming. Each beat said what words could not. You buried her. You silenced her. She rose. Barumo crawled from the circle. He ran. He tripped. He crawled again. Everywhere he went, the forest echoed her. In a clearing, the wind mimicked the rhythm she once played with her knuckles on pots. By a river, the water slapped rocks in a tempo only she had ever made. Even the frogs croaked in sequence, be-a-dum, like a chant. And so, Barumo wandered. Days folded into each other. He stopped trying to speak. His lips cracked. His eyes hollowed. He had tried to silence Kinna. Now the world refused to silence for him. Sometimes he saw her. Not clearly. Just a blur, movement behind a tree, a whisper through the leaves, laughter that trembled in the ground. Once, he swore he saw her standing in the river, drumming on the surface of the water with her palms. He had reached out. But it was only a reflection. And when it faded, the water wept sap. He returned once to the edge of Akuta. Not to beg forgiveness, he no longer had words, but to see if the rhythm had ended. It had not. Children danced with open joy. Women drummed freely in the square. The sacred drum still stood cracked but whole, the bracelet warm atop it. When Barumo stepped close, a child noticed and lifted her drumstick. She struck a beat. Others joined. Barumo stood frozen as the rhythm swelled around him. Not violent. Not hateful. Just true. He turned and vanished into the trees again, his silence complete. From that day on he became a myth, the man who couldn't speak. A warning. A whisper. A rhythm broken and never found again. But the rhythm he tried to bury? It lived in every footstep, every breath, and in the wind that followed him forever. The drumbeat never stopped. Long after Barumo's silence and disappearance, the wind still hummed with Kinna's rhythm. In the village of Akuta, where once only men were allowed to touch the sacred drums, something ancient had begun to stir. It started quietly like the beginning of a lullaby. One morning, a girl named Afi was seen crouched near the river, tapping two smooth stones together in a rhythm no one had heard since Kinna's time. The beat was soft, careful, but filled with memory. When her mother, Mara, found her, she expected shame or guilt, but Afi simply smiled. "She showed me," she said. Mara blinked. "Who?" "The girl from the drum." At first, the adults dismissed it as childish imagination. But that evening, Mara heard the same rhythm whispered through the trees as she fetched water. And when she closed her eyes, she saw a pair of hands. Not Afi's, not hers, but hands she remembered. Kinna's. Whispers began spreading through Ukuta like fire through dry grass. Other girls too began drumming in secret. They used anything they could find, gourds, hollowed logs, upturned baskets. They drummed not just to mimic but to remember. At first they practiced under moonlight, hiding behind huts in the woods by the river. But the rhythm was stronger than fear. One girl, Tano, said she dreamt of a circle of women, hands beating drums, their feet painting patterns in the dust. In the center stood Kinna, her hair loose and floating like smoke, eyes closed, singing with no mouth. Tano woke with her hands twitching. That morning she carved a drum from an old pot and wrapped it in goat hide. When she drummed, her sisters came running. And the wind, as if approving, carried her rhythm across the fields. Then came the gathering. One night, 20 girls stood around the old ceremonial drum. The very one Barumo had once used, the one that had held Kinna. They approached it slowly, cautiously. The wind rustled. A strange light clung to the cracked surface. Afi stepped forward first. She laid her palm on the drum. It was warm. Then she struck a single beat. The sound rang out like thunder, deep, rich, not hollow. The trees bowed. The air trembled. The earth listened. The others followed. One after another they added their rhythm. No instruction. No fear. Just instinct passed from blood to breath to bone. Together they created something new from what had been taken. The women of Akuta heard it. And for the first time in generations they did not rush to silence it. They came slowly, cautiously. Some with tears. Others with memory. They stood behind their daughters and granddaughters, unsure. Until one woman, Kamisa, the village herbalist, stepped forward. She took the reed basket that held her herbs, turned it over, and beat its base 3 times. The rhythm she played was old. Older than Barumo, older than the temple priests. It was the lullaby her grandmother had taught her before it was forbidden. The girls fell silent. Then one by one the mothers joined. Some sang. Some clapped. Some drummed on their own bellies, on their thighs, on the cracked earth. It was not polished or rehearsed. But it was real. It was theirs. By morning, the sacred square echoed with the rhythm of generations returning. The village council tried to intervene. The priest Alyamo approached with caution, still wrapped in the old ways. But even he paused when the drum spoke, not with anger but with clarity. "I hear her," he whispered. I hear them. From that moment, no law dared silence the rhythm. The girls drummed openly. They held gatherings in the field, then in the square. Soon boys joined them, not to lead but to follow, to listen, to learn. And so began the era of the drumming daughters. In school, rhythm became a lesson. In temples, the beat accompanied prayer. At births, girls were welcomed with song and drum, not silence. A new shrine was built, small, humble, near the cracked ceremonial drum. The villagers named it Nyumba Kina, Kina's home. They left bracelets, stones, scraps of cloth. They whispered hopes, shared memories, poured water at its base. And the drum, the one that once held her captive, began to beat with the wind. Not daily. Not always. But when needed. When a girl lost her mother and needed comfort. When a storm passed too loud, too quickly. When the fields were dry and the soil needed song. Always the drum responded. Not with anger. With presence. A young girl named Zina, barely 7, once curled beside it after a long day. She whispered, "I feel sad." No one heard her. No one was near. But the drum beat twice, soft and slow. Zina smiled and fell asleep to its rhythm. The village of Akuta transformed. Markets opened with songs led by girls. Ceremonies featured mother-daughter drumming duets. Elders recalled the rhythms they'd forgotten and taught them again, this time freely. No longer was drumming a weapon of power, it became a language of unity. Kina's name became more than a memory. It was a blessing, a rhythm in itself. She is the wind, the children said. She is the rhythm, the elders echoed. And the girls knew it in their hearts. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the sky darkened faster than usual. Thunder rumbled, not harsh but musical. The villagers paused. They looked to the cracked drum. It was pulsing, vibrating faintly. The girls gathered around it, drums ready. Afi stepped forward, looked to the sky, and drummed the pattern Kina once taught her in a dream. Tano joined, then Zina, then dozens more. The thunder matched them beat for beat. Rain fell, not violently but with rhythm. Like a drum blessing the soil. The villagers danced. They danced not to forget but to remember. They danced for Kina, for the spirits of the women who once drummed in secret, for the girls who now drummed openly. And above them, the sky echoed their joy. Not even the wind was silent anymore. The story of Kina could not be contained by the borders of Akuta. It began with travelers who passed through the village and left changed, carrying rhythms in their bodies they didn't realize they had memorized. A merchant from Yolongo spoke of girls drumming in the wind. A healer from Buji returned home and mimicked a beat he heard from a girl's dream. A warrior from Tembesa confessed he'd seen a cracked drum breathing in moonlight. And always, her name was whispered. Kina. They spoke it like a blessing, like a warning, like a song. In village after village, the tale changed in shape but never in soul. In one place they said she was a girl turned spirit. In another that she was a wind reborn in skin. Some claimed she lived inside every drum, others that she had no body but all rhythm. But all agreed, her beat healed, warned, guided. Drumming, once confined to celebration or ceremony, now had purpose deeper than tradition. It became justice. In the village of Utoni, a woman accused of theft drummed her truth for the elders. No words, just rhythm. She told her story in a pattern that made even the hardest-hearted elder weep. The real thief, unable to bear the beat, confessed. It became healing. In Kambala, a boy who hadn't spoken since birth tapped his fingers against a dried calabash. The rhythm matched the pace of his mother's lullaby. That night he said her name. Kina. And from then on he spoke freely. It became remembrance. In Itoro, when a beloved elder passed, her grandchildren sat by her grave and drummed her favorite rhythm into the earth. They swore the ground pulsed back, warm and grateful. Kina was not just a legend anymore. She was a language. When storms brewed and lightning cracked, villagers from miles around would gather indoors, not to hide but to listen. For on the rooftops, the wind struck patterns no natural breeze could craft. Some said it was Kina reminding them of her presence. Others said it was her guiding lost spirits. Either way, when it rained in Akuta, no one slept without drumming in response. And then one dusk, Barumo returned. No one saw him arrive. He simply appeared, thin, slouched, gray as smoke. His clothes hung loose, his eyes hollowed by something beyond hunger. He walked with no rhythm, no echo in his step. Silence followed him, but it wasn't peace, it was emptiness. The children stopped drumming when they saw him. The elders stiffened. The mothers reached for their daughters. But Barumo did not speak. Could not speak. He knelt before the shrine built for Kina, the one beside the cracked ceremonial drum. His knees sank into the dust like they belonged there. In his hands was a single drumstick, worn and splintered. It trembled as he held it out, as if even the wood remembered what it had done. And then gently he placed it at the shrine's base. No words were spoken. Only the wind moved, curling around the cracked drum like a familiar friend. Then the drum opened. Not broken. Not shattered. Opened, like a seed splitting in spring. Light spilled from the inside, not harsh or blinding but golden and warm, like the morning sun caught in a bowl. A low hum followed, deep and ancient, vibrating the air around them. Everyone gathered. Everyone watched. And then her voice came. It was not loud but it was felt. Not silence. Balance. 3 words spoken from nowhere and everywhere. Some fell to their knees. Others wept openly. Even Barumo, stooped, shaking, ashamed, lifted his face toward the drum, tears streaming freely. "I am sorry," he mouthed. The drum pulsed once like a heartbeat, then settled. The light dimmed, but it did not vanish. It curled into the shrine's wood, lingered in the air, glowed faintly on every nearby surface. The villagers stood in silence, then began to drum. Slowly, reverently. Not in mourning but in acknowledgement. Kinna had not returned to punish. She had returned to remind. Balance, not silence. From that moment, Kinna's story became a lesson taught to every child. In Ukuta and beyond, elders told it under stars and beside fires. Schools painted her image on their walls, arms lifted, rhythms spiraling from her fingertips. Her story became part of every harvest song, every welcome chant, every lullaby. She was caged in a drum, they said, but she made the drum her home. She was silenced, but she made rhythms speak louder than words. She was one and now she is all. In some places, girls began their drumming lessons by placing a hand on a drum and whispering Kinna's name. In others, entire festivals were dedicated to rhythm, where stories were told not in speech, but in beats and movements and silences between. The shrine in Akuta became a pilgrimage site. Drummers from distant villages came to play there, each offering a piece of their soul through rhythm. They said the drum still responded, sometimes in dreams, sometimes with wind, sometimes with the sudden warmth of the soil beneath their feet. Even Barumo remained. He never spoke again. But he stayed by the shrine, tending to it, brushing dust from the cracked drum, guiding travelers to the right path. He became known as the Silent Watcher. And though many never knew who he had been, those who did forgave him, not for his sake but because Kinna had already chosen balance over vengeance. Years passed. Generations changed. But every time a girl lifted a drumstick for the first time, someone would whisper, "Kinna watches." Not as a ghost, not as a threat, but as rhythm itself. In the hush between heartbeats, in the sway of tall grass, in the clap of thunder, in the thud of dancing feet, she lived. Not in silence. In balance.